Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at Abzan Control for the Dragons of Tarkir season as standard. With Dragons of Tarkir's release, Abzan didn't really gain a huge amount of support in the way of a bunch of new creatures and a bunch of new spells within the Abzan colors that are definitely going to shift the way that the deck's played entirely and are going to be a kind of new and refreshing thing for the meta to have all these different Abzan cards. Rather, with this deck, we gained cards like Ultimate Price and Duress that we're able to play that ultimately just give us a little bit more utility for the variety of matchups that we could face up against. So, not a lot has changed between my last update that I did for this deck in the previous season of Standard and right now where Dragons of Tarkir is actually out. But here's what I'm playing for Abzan Control. So to start things off, for our creatures, I'm only playing 9 of them main board. So the first one is Courser of Kruphix, and we're playing a playset of it. So Courser allows us to gain back life in grindy matchups. It also allows us to see more cards and play lands off the top of our library, rather than actually play them out of our hand and thus get us deeper into cards we actually want to see. Ultimately, it's just a really good blocker up against aggressive strategies as well, and our opponent doesn't really want us to have that Courser and to just see more cards constantly. We can also do manipulation with fetch lands where we can play our fetch off the top, see what we have on top of our library, and then we can actually just crack the fetch, shuffle, and reset whatever's on top of our library and have a brand new peek at what's on top. We have a playset of Siege Rhino, so Siege Rhino is kind of like our win condition in the deck outside of the actual Planeswalkers themselves. If your opponent can't answer the Siege Rhino, especially if you're playing them in sequence, you're just going to grind out the game very easily. A 4/5 for 4 with Trample that also has an Enter the Battlefield ability that lets you gain 3 and your opponent loses 3 is just monumental. And even whenever you're behind, playing Siege Rhinos in sequence up against like aggressive red decks or something like that proves to be a very good winning strategy just by you jamming creatures out onto the battlefield. Our 9th and final creature in the main board here is Tasigur. So Tasigur, just as a one-of, allows you to reuse cards in your graveyard and also just get a cheap creature out of delving away stuff. So with Tasigur, you're not really just going to be jamming him out onto the table as soon as possible. With him, you're just going to be kind of playing your removal and stuff to just get rid of your opponent's creatures really quick, and soon into the game, you're going to be cracking your fetches, which fuel your graveyard as well. And then from that point, you delve with Tasigur, shape your graveyard based on the matchup that you're actually playing against, and from there, with his mill ability, you are going to at least have some targets that you want to actually get back to your hand based on what you're playing against. So in the case of playing against like a heavy Planeswalker deck, you're going to want to keep your Hero's Downfalls actually in your grave and not delve those away. That way, if you mill yourself with Tasigur and 2 lands come off the top, then you're getting your Hero's Downfall, which is in the grave, or amongst other targets that you might have, like maybe a Planeswalker or something like that. But Tasigur allows you to get a huge amount of value, especially in the late game, with getting a creature essentially for 1 black mana that for 4 mana you can get something back from your grave, especially if you brick off of milling 2 lands off the top. Sometimes just bricking like that ends up going to your advantage and you get to get something that is actually just really insane. As for the rest of the cards in the main deck, I have a playset of Thoughtseize for like the slower matchups, so up against things like the mirror match or up against like control, you want to have Thoughtseize so you can pick away your opponent's hand to take their good valuable cards and also have information for how you should be playing your next following turns. Up against like the red slide decks that are like 1 and 2 converted mana cost for the most part, you want to be siding this card out for like Drowning Sorrows and another Bile Blight. Speaking of which, we do have 3 Bile Blight in the main board. I think this card is still just really good at being able to deal with a lot of different threats in the format. Outside of just dealing with things like Rebel Master and Seeker, it also deals with overlapping tokens. So if your opponent's playing like Whirling Outburst, if they're playing like Dragon Fodder or anything like that, and even whenever you get into the realm of playing against opposing Elspeths and Elspeth threatening a ultimate, just having the Bile Blight to be able to get rid of all the tokens is really, really great and provides to be pretty useful even just if you're playing up against aggressive decks. I have 2 Ultimate Price, so that's our new addition from Dragons of Tarkir. Ultimate Price is really great just because it hits so many different things in the format. Seeker, Rabblemaster, Shorecrasher, Elemental. It'll hit your Thunderbreak Regents, Stormbreath Dragons. Up against like the Green Devotion decks, it'll still hit cards like Whisperwood Elemental, Courser of Kruphix. It's just really great, and I think Ultimate Price is a wonderful addition to actually have in the format. With that, we also have a playset of Hero's Downfall at our disposal here. So Hero's Downfall is just kind of the most universal removal that we have. At 3 mana, destroying a creature or a planeswalker at instant speed is just insane. 1 copy of Utter End, just because you want another way to deal with planeswalkers, and at the same time you want to deal with cards like Outpost Siege that could potentially get really problematic very quick. There's a playset of Abzan Charm as well, so Abzan Charm is pretty useful in all of its modes. The modes that you're going to be using predominantly with this deck, playing against pretty much anything, are going to be to exile a creature that is power 3 or greater, or you're just going to be drawing cards off of it, which up against any matchup, Abzan Charm is just pretty good. There are very narrow instances where you just don't want that Abzan Charm. However, the majority of the time, that Abzan Charm is basically just going to stay in. There's 1 copy of Murderous Cut just because it's another easy way to have like 1 more removal spell for cards like Stormbreath Dragon that you actually want to take care of. Maybe you don't have like another Hero's Downfall in your hand. You had to waste it on like a Challenger Pyromancer or something like that. Having the Murderous Cut that you can delve away into and get rid of like a Stormbreath Dragon is really great, especially if you're only paying like 1 mana or 2 mana for it. There's 1 copy of End Hostilities in the main board. There's another copy in the sideboard, but End Hostilities is just really great for like the Devotion decks. You just don't want them to get a huge amount of tempo and board advantage over you, and just having a clear board wipe is really great. So for the Planeswalkers in the deck, the first one that I have here is Sorin. So Sorin is really good up against non-Crackling Doom decks. So up against like decks that are playing Crackling Doom, I end up just siding him out. However, up against pretty much everything else, he's really great because he provides one service or another. So up against like the mirror match, if you're both on like your turn 4 and both of you are just keeping removal open and nobody's doing anything because you're just trying to wait for the other person to just make the first play, playing Sorin on turn 4 on just a completely empty board on both sides is really great because you generate the 2/2 onto the board and you also retain your Sorin, which they actually have to deal with both of those cards then at that point. And if they deal with Sorin, you can just keep on bashing away with a 2/2. So Sorin ends up being really good in that. He also gains you back a huge amount of life whenever you're playing up against aggressive decks, and you already have like even a Courser and just like maybe 1 or 2 Coursers out on the battlefield. Having 3-4 Coursers that can either sit on the battlefield and block, or can just attack away and gain you back life is really great. I'm still playing 3 Elspeth Sun's Champion in the deck, so Elspeth proves to be just easily one of the best win conditions that this deck actually has because she's also versatile for being removal up against decks that are playing overlapping and consistent 4 power and greater creatures in their actual list. So in the case of playing up against like Green Devotion, where they have like Whisperwood Elementals, their Genesis Hydras, and even things like Pelucranos, being able to drop an Elspeth, wrath their board of all of their actual value creatures that they were investing mana into is exactly where we want to be. And also just being able to generate those tokens. There are a lot of decks that honestly just can't deal with the tokens that Elspeth makes, and you end up just gumming up the board for the next couple of turns until she ends up just ultimating. And last but not least here, we have our Ugin, just as a one-of. So honestly, Ugin wins me so many games, it's actually ridiculous. If the game actually elongates to the point where both me and my opponent are in the very late game and we're both nearing top deck mode, just topping a Ugin is basically assuring you're going to win the game for the most part. Being able to wrath the board, especially up against decks that just overcommit onto the board itself, is going to assure you that your opponent's just going to get punished for what they were doing in the game, and basically the game's going to be unwinnable for the most part. So the only real instances where Ugin is just kind of mediocre and not really that great is that your opponent's playing Mastery of the Unseen, or they're playing Whisperwood Elemental and they have a bunch of Manifest guys. Otherwise, the Ugin just being able to wrath the board is pretty much a sure shot for you to be able to play any other threats you have in your hand and just grind out the rest of the game. And now on to the sideboard. So as you guys can see, my sideboard is very 1 and 2 of heavy here. I'm playing 2 Duress, 2 Fleecemane Lion, a Secure the Wastes, a Read the Bones, Dromoka, Liliana Vess, Tasigur, an Erase, 2 Drown in Sorrow, a Bile Blight, a End Hostilities, and a Glare of Heresy. Now, the reason to actually just diversify what you're playing in your sideboard and not just jam 4 copies of multiples of things is that we want to have a variety of different cards that we can play in different matchups, and conveniently enough, those cards overlap and are useful in other matchups. So whenever it comes to like the Liliana Vess and like the Tasigur, even like the Dromoka as well, those are cards that are really useful in the mirror match, but are also useful up against control. So we don't have to allocate slots for one matchup and then have to allocate more slots for another matchup. So starting it off with a discussion, we have our Duress. So Duress is good up against like any token strategies that are just jamming a bunch of like token generating spells. So if your opponent's playing like Hordeling Outburst, Raise the Alarm, Dragon Fodder, Dot Deck, alongside like Stoke the Flames, we want to side in our Duress just to be able to pick away at things that they have. And it's also an easy way to pick away at things and also not lose life for it as well. Otherwise, Duress is good up against control because we actually do want to have all 6 disrupts for that matchup. And I usually side in 1 copy of Duress for like the mirror match as well, because a lot of the Abzan decks will just side heavy on like Planeswalkers, so they could side in things like Nissa, they could side in like a Liliana Vess and stuff like that. And being able to have disrupts for just like their removal if they're keeping it in their hand, or even their actual proactive threats that they're trying to put onto the table, is really, really great and is exactly what we want to be doing with a card like Duress. The Fleecemane line that we have here as a 2 of is mainly for like the aggressive matchups as well as the very slow grindy matchups. So Fleecemane Lion ends up siding in for the aggro matchups by us siding out cards like a Ugin and an Elspeth that would otherwise be just way too slow. With that, we have our Fleecemane Lion that we can potentially play on turn 2, gum up the board for our opponent and not allow them to get a huge amount of tempo over us. Even if we just end up trading the Fleecemane Lion for one of our opponent's guys in a Titan Strength, that's exactly what we want to have happen and keep our opponent from dealing progressively more damage to us that we just really can't stop. Up against the slower matchups like the Mirror Match and Control, we want to have this card because we can threaten to give it Monstrous, and it actually just kind of forces our opponent to be in a really tough situation where they either have to have like 2 removal spells to be able to get rid of it, or they have to really catch us off guard, which usually shouldn't be the case because you're going to play that Fleecemane line and you're going to ride it out if you have that 5 mana open until your opponent ends up messing up somewhere and they have to actually do something about it. The 1 of Secure the Wastes that I have here is pretty much for the same multi-purpose like I explained for Fleecemane Lion. It's a card that can gum up aggressive strategies while also being a pseudo win condition for the slower strategies. With playtesting with this card and even just like theory crafting with this, the mindset that I had with this card is that knowing how Abzan control actually sideboards if they're playing Bile Blight is that if they're going into the mirror match, even if you kind of suspect your opponent of siding in the Fleecemane lines, usually you're still going to side out your Bile Blights just because you can't for a fact know that they're bringing them in or not. So the majority of the time, the Abzan control deck is just going to be siding out their Bile Blights. So setting in Secure the Wastes and just being able to use it for an X value of like 6 or 7 when your opponent doesn't even have like a Elspeth or something like that is usually just very, very huge, and you can gain a huge amount of momentum over your opponent when they might just have like a Abzan Charm or a Hero's Downfall that they're saving for one of your threats. The same thing kind of goes for like the aggressive matchups. Even if you don't get a huge amount of value off of that X that you're actually casting for against aggro, just even having a bunch of chump blockers up against Sly is really great, and it'll ultimately just kind of stall out the board until you actually are able to do something bigger for the turn. The 1 of Read the Bones is there for these very, very slow matchups, especially if your opponent's playing like Duress and Disrupts themselves. Being able to see 2 cards off the top with the Scry and then draw 2 is just exactly what you want to have in those slow, grindy matchups where you get to actually shape what you're drawing. The 1 of Dromoka is for control and the mirror match as well, forcing the mirror match to be able to only play spells on their turn and removal on your creatures on their turn is honestly just insane outside of the actual stats that the Dragonlord actually has. But up against control, even just forcing them to not be able to play counters during your turn and forcing them to Wrath, like maybe a board that just has the Dromoka out on there as well, is just absolutely insane for just forcing your opponent to do something about it. The Dragonlord is, honestly, it's been just one of the best 1-ofs that I've had in the sideboard. I might go up to 2, but honestly, just as a 1-of, the card's been really great. One of Liliana Vess for, again, the slower matchups where forcing your opponent to discard could be beneficial, but also being able to tutor for like an Ugin or an Elspeth is also equally as beneficial. One of Tasigur for the more grindy matchups where we just want to be recurring stuff from our graveyard a little bit more. One of Erase for the decks that are playing things like Chain to the Rocks, Outpost, Siege, anything in the in-between like that. I'll also side into Erase up against like the heroic decks as well because I don't want their ordeals to actually stick and crack on their attacks. So even if my opponent does play the ordeal on their creature, having the Erase to get rid of the ordeal before they attack is just one way of trying to keep them from doing as much against us. 2 Drown in Sorrow just as a smaller sweeper for any of the small creatures that your opponent's playing. If they're playing a bunch of X2 or less creatures, then you just want to be siding in your Drown in Sorrow to get maximum value over them. The 1 Bile Blight for the matchups where your opponent's obviously playing a bunch of smaller creatures. If they're playing like Seeker of the Way, Soulfire Grandmaster and Goblin Rabblemaster deck, then you just want to have the Bile Blight for more ways to deal with their actual cards. And especially Rabblemaster in general, you just want to have more ways to deal with Rabblemaster before it gets out of hand. One more End Hostilities, almost exclusively just for like the Green Devotion decks. You're not really as worried about having a second End Hostilities for the other matchups as much as you are just for Green Devotion to not allow them to do a whole lot against you. And the one of Glare of Heresy, which Glare of Heresy is good up against like control decks that are playing Narset, so you want to have another way to deal with Narset. It's good up against Heroic because their actual Heroic guys that they're playing are going to be white. And also up against like the Abzan deck where you could potentially get rid of things like Fleecemane Lion, Inoffensive if they're playing the aggro variant, Sorin's, Elspeth's. There's just a lot of different targets that you can hit with Glare of Heresy. It's honestly just about knowing the matchup, what your opponent's actually playing, and then being able to appropriately sideboard with those types of cards. It also ends up being good up against like the Mastery of the Unseen decks because you can get rid of Mastery of the Unseen with the Glare, and you can also get rid of Fleecemane Lion before it becomes monstrous. So that is our deck tech here for Abzan Control for the Dragons of Tarkir Season of Standard. As you guys can see, not a huge amount has actually changed, but there are some differences with the deck and some new cards that we actually get to play with here. So if you guys enjoyed the deck tech, I would appreciate it if you thumbs up the video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. But until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and peace out.